Okay, everyone, we're going to be talking about compositing in Photoshop today. So you're going to want to make sure that you've downloaded those 6 demo images, which I've posted up for you. I've also included a link to those images in the link here in my YouTube video. If you look in the comments, you're going to need those as we walk through how to create a collage that looks realistic in Photoshop. So we're going to be going over some of those strategies today, and go ahead and open up Photoshop and we'll get started by creating a new project. I am going to go into create new to get started, and I'm going to show you guys how to, as a review, make sure that you're setting up a document in Photoshop that would be appropriate for moving into your imaginary landscape project. I'm going to call this, however, last name, first name, technical exercise 1, collage. And I'm actually going to size this the same as my imaginary landscape, just so that you guys are aware what that looks like for moving forward. So I'm going to have my width at 12, my height at 10. You might choose to have more of a vertical format for your imaginary landscape. And then importantly, my resolution needs to be set to 300 pixels per inch, and I know that I'm working in RGB color mode. Background contents, I'm going to keep that at white because I want to make sure that ultimately I fill in all of the white space for this collage that I'm making for my technical exercise, because that's exactly what that expectation will be moving into the imaginary landscape. Now, the difference between your previous project, the 1 in 20, where you had to create 1 image, for the imaginary landscape project, you'll be creating 3 of them, and they might have some overlapping content and ideas, which would be great, so they really form a series. But remember, you're going to be creating 3 high-resolution pieces in series for your imaginary landscape first digital collage. Moving forward with our technical exercise, I'm going to go ahead and click Create, and that should give me a nice white background here as it pops up. We'll wait just a second here as my spinning rainbow wheel of death works itself out. Cool. And it's all white as I instructed it, which is great. Right now I'm looking at this document at 33.33%, but I'm glad that I can see the whole entire frame, which is excellent. The next thing I'm going to do is pull in my 6 selection demo images that I've downloaded from D2L. I'm going to pull those directly into Photoshop. I can right click and hit open with as well, but I find that the drop and drag method works extremely well to just take the content that you want to make sure pops up and have that populate. I'm not exactly sure why I'm getting this strange libraries message here. Cool. See if we can pull this little guy away for a minute here. Awesome. So as I start getting into Photoshop, the couple of things that I want to do, and some of you guys, depending on how you've used Photoshop in the past or how you have it set up, if you're not seeing all of these windows like layers, channels, paths, adjustments, you can always reset your whole Photoshop display by going into Window Workspace and clicking on Essentials. Essentials is a really great starting point for anyone who's getting into Photoshop. And then as you start to realize you're using some tools more than others, you can always your layout, your menus, but just note, if you can't see something that you think you should be seeing, you can always go into Window Workspace Essentials, and that will sort of give you a nice starting point. The other thing I like to do in Photoshop, as a rule of thumb, is always utilize this green plus sign button so that Photoshop really covers up my whole entire screen, and I can sort of get immersed in the process of creation. If I'm working on something, I like to turn off notifications from text messages or from social media so that I can really focus on the task at hand. Great. So now I have my white canvas over here, and I have a whole series of selection demo images. The one I'd actually like to start with is selection demo image 3, which is this awesome fabricated New York-esque landscape. Now, the goal for today is to show you guys a bunch of tools in collaging, a bunch of selection tools specifically, and how to utilize best practices. The first thing that I want to be very clear about is the idea of destructive editing versus non-destructive editing. Now, if you have your notebook next to you, write this down: destructive editing versus non-destructive editing. If you don't have a notebook with you right now, pause the video and go grab one, because there's going to be a lot of keyboard shortcuts and ideas that we go over today. Now, the thing that makes the difference between an amateur Photoshop user and a professional Photoshop user is that amateur Photoshop users like to work quickly and like to quote-unquote destroy they're destructive editors, and they will utilize a starting image and then modify it to a point where you can never go back and change things. What I am teaching you in this class is more of the professional best practices route. We talk about non-destructive editing. In other words, once I wrap up on any given collage, I could pass my image off, my whole Photoshop file, to my boss, my supervisor, my employer, and they could create adjustments and go from there and be able to see the process, all of the layers underneath. If you are an amateur Photoshop editor, you will have a lot of trouble if you constantly destructively edit when it comes to working in this software professionally. So speaking from experience, going back and forth between my two colleagues in the photo studio, when we do have bigger compositing challenges and tasks, the expectation is that we're non-destructively editing. So please write that down and keep that in mind as we move forward. I'm going to start by looking at this nice geometric building right over here, sandwiched between these other two buildings, because it's a nice, easy starting point. The first selection tool that we talked about as you guys are using your 1 in 20 imagery is this rectangular marquee tool. If I right-click on this tool, I can see that I can make a rectangular selection, a circular selection, or I can create a single row marquee tool or column marquee tool. I don't really need to worry about those right now, but I do know that if I hit the M button, I get a nice rectangular selection that I can drag over any given part of the image, and I can hit Command C to copy, and I can come back over to my collage and paste it on there. Now, this is not really a collage of the building. This is more of a rectangular idea, which might be useful in some sense, but not exactly what I'm going for, but just as a quick review. So I'm going to get rid of this layer by dragging it into the trash can here, and let me bounce back over here. If I hit Command D, I lose those dots, and I, in essence, lose that selection. Your more sophisticated selection tools are actually going to be located as the third bar, generally speaking, in the toolbar. And if I hit Control click or right click over here, I have 3 different lasso tools, and that is the keyboard shortcut L. Now, a lot of people starting out will try to utilize the lasso tool to grab a certain area, and this is sort of, I call it the noodly lasso, because it's basically like kind of a bad version of MS Paint. Like if you're trying to get a really interesting, weird, organic shape, this is great, but when it comes to actually outlining something with precision, this is never a great tool to start with. I barely ever use the straight up lasso tool. It is just way too flimsy and does not have the layer of accuracy that I need to make a selection for something. So I'm going to hit Command D. I'm going to right click on that tool and go down to the next one, which is called the Polygonal Lasso tool. If I select that, I'm going to get a lasso where I can essentially plug and play. I clicked right there at the corner. I have this nice straight geometric line. I'm dealing with a geometric object, so this makes sense. I'll click up here at this corner here. Swing over on this side. Click over here, and I'm making a nice geometric selection of this building by essentially dropping down anchor points. Here we go. Now this is a little trickier because this is not quite geometric because you have that like Spanish style frame, but definitely try selecting out this building with your Polygonal Lasso tool. And for now, follow along with the demo. At the end of the demo, what I'd like to see you do is experiment creating your own composition, your own collage. So don't make exactly like what I do, but utilize the tools that you learned today in order to make something awesome happen on your own composition using the limitation of these 6 images. So follow along for now, but feel free to break off at the end of the lecture as you continue to work on this. So I'm going to hit Command C to copy. I'm going to pop over here to my collage. I'm going to hit Command V to paste. And here I have a blue and orange building that's popped up as layer 1. I am going to go ahead and make sure that I am labeling my layers right now. Orange and blue building. I don't want to ever have a whole stack of layers that are just layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I will quickly lose track of what all of those are as I get deeper and deeper into making really intense, interesting collage work. So you want to start from the get-go, starting to label your layers, because once you do have 50 or 60 layers floating around and you're grouping layers, you're putting them together, you want to stay organized on the front end. And that's why I always will label any of the layers that I'm working with. Great. So one thing I want to point your attention to is having selected this out and pasted it, I have a really harsh, super digital looking line, essentially where this was cut out, which worked perfectly for your 1 in 20 project because it was a pretty geometric format, rigid guidelines, etc. When you're trying to build something as a digital collage and you want it to look a bit more realistic, something that you should consider doing, in fact, I do this with essentially every layer all the time whenever I'm compositing something for a client or I'm putting something together as a personal digital collage as my own art project. If I want things to have a bit more realism, what I want to do while this is selected, I have all my marching dots around them. Going to go to Select, Modify, Feather. And if you do have your notebook, write this down. Select, Modify, Feather. I can also get to that window, that dialog box, by holding down Shift F6. So if you want to write those down, I highly encourage it. Feathering is what's going to give any selection in your collage that touch more of dimensionality. What does feather selection mean? Well, it means at the very edge of any of my given selections, I'm going to add just a very slight nuanced touch of softness. So I'm going to feather that radius at, generally speaking, between 2 and 5 pixels will be perfectly fine. And I'll hit OK. You're not going to see a lot happen here with the selection, but to show you, if I hit Command C to copy and come over here to my collage and hit Command V to paste, I'm going to grab my Move tool here while I'm over by my toolbar. If I look at the difference between the edges, I'll scroll down here. You'll notice that the edges of the feathered one are quite a bit softer than the edges of the super rigid one. And I might have to modify my selection so I'm not grabbing quite as much of the the blue, but still, even with a little bit of the background being picked up, it's going to lend the illusion on a larger scale of your layers not feeling quite as strictly digital. So let me show you what I mean in one other sense. If I come back over to selection demo image 3 and hit Command C to copy, Command V to paste, you're going to notice that this feels a lot more natural, or as though it were cut out with a pair of scissors, as opposed to super, super digital once it's actually sitting on top of other content. And this is great because it's sort of a guaranteed drop shadow effect without having to go in and add a super cheesy Photoshop version of the drop shadow to your image. Cool. I'm going to throw this one in the trash. I'm not going to name it just yet. Command minus. Now you notice, oh no, I lost my selection. Well, here's another great keyboard shortcut. If I hit Command R, sometimes I can reselect, sometimes not. I guess I lost it in this sense. But what happens if I do actually lose a given selection? Well, let's try one other selection technique, and then I'll show you how you can save a selection to recall it at any given point. So I'm going to hop over to this pink building right here. It's kind of a piece of a building to cut out, but could be really interesting if I want to create quite abstract composition. Hopping back over to my lasso tools, if I hit the if I right click over here, the magnetic lasso tool is honestly probably my favorite tool that you have at your disposal for making selections. And I'll show you why here in a second. Similar to the polygonal lasso tool, if I start sort of creating these anchor points and I'm kind of clicking along the way, I'm staying next to areas that have a decent amount of contrast, but the tool itself is dropping these little anchor points that are clinging or snapping to areas of contrast for that given object. Now, granted, this is not going to go as quickly as your polygonal lasso tool, but if you're dealing with something that might be partially geometric and partially curvaceous, like this pink building here, the selection process is going to be far more precise, far more accurate, and it's going to be super useful for moving forward and making your selections from the images that you select for your imaginary landscape project. Again, this is taking time, but you can't do everything super fast, super easy. The idea of the Magic Wand tool in Photoshop, the idea that it just might select exactly the thing that you need, it honestly never really comes through. You notice I kind of messed up that little part over there, and there is a way to get that back, which we'll talk about here shortly. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is because this is going into my collage and I might cover that up. So I'm hopping down with my magnetic lasso tool and you're like, oh man, I hope she gets it. The nice thing is, as I pull down over here, my image should kind of follow. Yep. As we slide down. Great. All right, and then I'm gonna pop back up. And you're kind of seeing, you know, if I swipe a bit faster, my spacing between the tiny pins that I'm dropping becomes a bit more extended or elongated. Remember, patience is a really important thing here. So you're not going to get a super accurate selection unless you do have patience throughout that process. Boom, I connect to my first point, and here I have a decent selection of this pink building at curvature and all. So first thing I'm going to do is go into select, modify, feather. Get into the habit of doing this whenever you make a selection, just for that added layer of three-dimensionality. I'm going to get my feathering at 3 pixels. It's going to feather outwards, which is fine with me. I can also have it feather inward if I say apply effect at canvas bounds, but 3 pixels is totally fine. If I do feel like it's going to expand too much, I can always go into select, modify, expand or contract, and this will actually expand or contract the surface area of your selection. So let's say I contract by 2 pixels. Cool, so now my selection's a tiny bit more inward, but that also means that my feathering is gonna not capture as much of the background. I just did all that work. I magnetically lassoed this whole building, and then I applied 2 effects to it. If I want to save that selection, all I need to do is go into select, save selection, again in the same place as select, modify, select, save selection. Your selection menu is really important. And I get a dialog box that pops up, and I can save this as pink building, and I'll know that I can recall it at any time. So I'll hit OK, and it saves. If I hit Command C, I can copy it, and then Command V to paste. We will call it pink building. And then, see, I already lost that selection, but if I hit V, that keyboard shortcut, I get my move tool, and I can see how nice and soft that edge is, sort of nuanced like, and I can start to create something. Now if I want to make that selection happen again, I go up into select, load selection, and great, pink building, awesome. Now the one thing I want to look for is what my selection is actually responding to. Your load selections are going to sit basically on top of whatever layer you have selected. So in this case, it's actually not on the background layer, which I need it to be in order to carry the content from the background layer. If you're ever like, why is there nothing in my selection after all that work? The thing is, you're probably on the wrong layer. So you always need to make sure that you're on the layer where that content is. So now if I hit Command C again, Command V, that layer will paste again for me. And I can start to create something kind of weird and sci-fi. Maybe I'll call this Pink Building 2, and in the future maybe I'll group all of those layers together if I decide to do something with them. Great, so those are your various selection tools. Now, if I want to select a layer specifically, make sure you're watching this part because Adobe is notorious for having a lot of really small buttons and small things. What I'm going to do is actually hover over this selection right here. I'm going to hold down my Command button. This will be Control if you're working on a PC. Command or Control, click on that thumbnail, and you notice it brings back the selection of that specific object. And now if I hit the V button, I can move it around again, or do something to it, or add an adjustment layer to it in the future. But I can always get Command V, can always get that selection back on a given layer by hovering over the thumbnail, holding down the Command or Control button, and then clicking on that layer thumbnail. So maybe this is a bit too much repetition and I want to change things up a little bit. And I'm on my first pink building layer that I created with my magnetic lasso tool. If I go into Edit, Transform, I have a few options. Some of you guys might have used the scaling option a tad bit to fill in those white spaces for your 1 in 20 project, but I can also rotate, skew, distort, perspective, warp. Anything that's not scale, rotate, any of these stricter rotations or flips, all of these skew, distort, perspective, warp, be really careful with these because they can tend to pixelate if you're pushing or pulling one thing too far in one direction. So I would just be wary of these ones. But your scaling option, for example, gives you a box to shrink things down or scale things up. And if I hold down my option key as I'm scaling, please write this one down as well. If I hold down my option key while I'm scaling, I can maintain the original aspect ratio. The other thing to write down is if you're scaling within your composition and holding down that option key, you can always scale down without losing information, but you will lose information if you scale up. You will get pixelation the further up you go in that scaling process. So I recommend using larger images that you're putting together so that you always have the option of scaling down and you don't have to scale up. But holding down that option key is really important so that you don't get sort of like a weird, like twisted version where it starts to get smushed. For example, by going into Edit, Transform, Scale. If I don't have my option key held down, oh, it seems like it's locked for me here, which is kind of cool. If I hold down, at least my keyboard here, if I hold down the Shift button, I can scale things with an extremeness one way or another. I recommend, generally speaking, that you maintain your aspect ratio. So I'm going to hit Command Z on that to undo. I don't actually want to do that. The other thing you can do is go into Edit, Transform. You can rotate your object 90 degrees, 180 degrees. You can also flip it if you want it to kind of face an opposite direction, which could be kind of cool in this case. And you can, as I mentioned, rotate it, and this will actually give you the opportunity to pull one thing to one side or another. Cool. If I come over to my other pink building, I can move that over. I'm going to hit Command deselect so that's not in the way, and this is starting to look a little bit more interesting. Hit Command minus, scroll back, starting to put things together in an interesting way in this collage. Now, because I'm non-destructively editing and I want this to not be saved as selection demo image 3 because I've done work to it, I'm going to go up to File, Save As. I'll put it in the same folder so that I know how to navigate it. And I'm going to put it into, I had a desktop folder, I think, selection demo images. I'll save this as a PSD because I have made changes to it. I want to make sure that I'm saving that PSD file in addition to my starting JPEG point. So I'll call this demo image 3 Photoshop version for now. So just be aware of, as you're working, making sure that you are saving things as their own file throughout the process. Great. So the next thing I'm going to do, and I would encourage you guys to maybe at some point once we get started, I'm going to have you pause so that you can work with me on this. But I'm going to come over to demo image 1, which is a picture of my hand on a big tree stump. And if you notice, going into image size, this is a massive photo taken on a high-res digital camera. So if I wanted to print this at 300 resolution, I went into image size, I could print this out at 24 inches by 16 inches without losing quality, which is pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead and change it to 300 resolution in any case because I know I'm going to be transferring it to a document, my technical exercise 1 collage document, and I want it to be the appropriate resolution. Man, you can see a lot of skin. Cool. So now I'm at 300 resolution and I'm going to start working. The thing I would like you to try, because this is going to be very useful as we get into our discussion of quick mask mode, is I'd like you to grab the magnetic lasso tool, like what we just used, to select out that pink building. And I'd like you to make a selection of this very organic object, my hand, by dragging this around the outside. And the thing that I want you to be aware of in this process is if your selection is not perfect, that is totally okay. In fact, that will be ideal because it will lend some purpose to our next step. It's really hard to get a super perfect selection on anything at any given time, so just keep that in mind. And there's always ways to go back and fix that work non-destructively. That's why we non-destructively edit. Yeah, my magnetic lasso is definitely failing where the ring is between the fingers, so I know that I'll be coming back to that section. Again, you can probably hear this in the recording. I'm just clicking periodically with the mouse to set some of those anchor points for myself. Definitely kind of struggling going around the thumb here, but there we go. Cool. I know this is a little bit tedious, but the more you do this, the more you'll get used to it, and the faster you'll get, and you'll know also how to go back and kind of correct for some of the errors there. And again, there's going to be things that I go over a bit, like several times redundantly. So if you are lost on something, just know that if I've done it once, I will probably do it again, because that's how all of this learning kind of happens when it comes to technical demos and demonstrations. So cool, I've gotten my whole hand selected. So what's the first thing I'm going to do? Always go up to select, modify, feather that edge. We want to get rid of those super strict digital edges. So I'm going to go to select, modify, feather. Go ahead and modify that by 3 pixels. Looks great. And here we go. So the other thing I'm going to do, that did not take a short period of time. So I'm going to go into select, save selection. And so that I can always recall the selection, I'm going to call it hand. Great. Now I know for a fact if I zoom in, Command plus, that I definitely messed up around the ring here. I messed up around the finger. The magnetic lasso tool is not perfect. I missed part of my thumb over here, and hopefully you guys have a few areas where you messed up as well. So this next step is really going to help us fine-tune that selection. To do it for this particular case, I'm going to come over and turn on Quick Mask Mode. Quick Mask Mode, you can get there by either clicking this little tiny button that looks like kind of a camera at the very bottom of your toolbar here, or I can very simply hit Q. So if you want to write down that keyboard shortcut Q, that's what it is. Whenever I switch over to Quick Mask Mode, it's going to show all of the area that I don't have selected in red and all of the area that I do have selected in the normal color of the image. And I can definitely see all of the areas where I messed up a little bit. So how do we fix this? Well, Quick Mask Mode is really helpful because it gives us the opportunity to use the brush tool to essentially go back and fill in wherever we might have made mistakes along the way. And to get to the brush tool, I can very simply hit the B button, or I can come over here and find this little thing that looks like a paintbrush. Now, common misconception. Photoshop, a lot of people think, as you're getting started, that the brush tool is specifically for painting, for creating beautiful marks, you know, sort of like their demo over here. I will say from a photo perspective and from a design perspective, I almost never use the brush tool as like an MS Paint thing. I'm almost always using the brush tool to create stronger, more resolute selections, and doing that very intentionally for masking, for layers, all of that, what we're about to do. So this is not necessarily a drawing tool, but a tool to help us create a better selection in this case. So I have a brush, and whenever I click a tool, like we talked about, we're always going to get this whole array of different effects that we can add to that tool that pop up here under your brush options. So there's different types of brush if you have presets loaded. There is a button drop down that shows you the size and the hardness of the brush. So that's how hard or soft it is around the edges. The blending mode of that brush, which we'll talk about here in a bit. The opacity of that brush, the flow, and then the smoothing. So the ones to really look for seriously are mostly dealing with opacity and then your brush mode. The first thing to note, if you look at your keyboard, you probably have a button that says delete up at the top right. So if you look down at that, underneath the delete button, you probably have a backslash button. Next to that backslash button, you should have bracket keys. Those little brackets are extremely useful for adjusting to the right to make your brush bigger and to the left to make your brush smaller. These are so important, especially as you're going around different areas. And if you don't have a stylus that does this for you. So I'm just literally working with a keyboard and mouse. I'm going to hit Command plus to zoom in a little bit more. The brush, bam, that's not what I want, right? But I just did that by holding down. I'm going to hit Command Z here in a second. But you can kind of see how soft this brush is. It's definitely a harder edge than around sort of where I've feathered my selection. So I'm going to hit Command Z. I'm going to pop up here. I do need to adjust this manually. I'm going to come over to hardness and pull that down to maybe 47%. So now you can see that brush has a lot softer edge around the outside. I'm going to hit Command Z because that's not where I want it. But you notice I'm painting in red. I'm painting in the area that I don't want when really I want to paint in the area that I do want here when I'm trying to modify this selection. So I'd like to point your attention over here to your toolbar again. Your quick mask mode was right down here, or at the letter Q, how we got into that. And then I have this thing called your foreground and your background layer. These need to constantly be set to black or white, and they both need to be different, and they both need to be on each of the ends of that spectrum in order for that to work. If you have one of these set to blue or pink or green, this whole process is not going to work for you. So be sure that you have these set to black and white. You'll notice if I hit the X button on my keyboard, they swap. And this essentially tells me similar to our lecture about what is foreground, what is background, what is subject, what is background, etc. You can see those two things switch around, which is really useful because when I hit that X button, or I can hit this little tiny button over here that has the switchy switch, X button is a lot easier. If I hit X, I can determine, Command Z, hit X, whether I'm painting in my selection or if I'm painting in my background. And this will become super useful. And you're like, oh man, but you already saved that selection. X again. That's okay. I can resave it as hand edited and we will be in a great spot. And then I can go ahead and fill in all of those areas that I didn't quite get perfectly, like the ring over here, and sort of take a more detailed approach to grabbing all of those bits and pieces. Now, the great thing about quick mask mode is that I can make all of these decisions before I actually cut out this whole hand. If you want to work on fixing your selection as you listen to me talk, that's totally cool too, depending on how you're listening to the demo right now. But something to note on this part is a lot of amateur Photoshop users will just go for it and put the selection in and try to edit it afterwards. The really nice thing about quick mask mode is that it allows you to make all of those fine-tuned edits to your selection before you actually put your content in. And then you can constantly go back to it, change it, modify it. Which is really nice. I'm not actually taking any content away from the fingers or adding content to the fingers. Instead, I am simply, getting the selection ready to do it live. Go. And depending on how sort of obsessive you are and how big the area is that you're going to be using, you can get pretty detailed and pretty obsessive in this process, for sure. But the great thing about Photoshop is that you can kind of constantly create the illusion that something is there. And so in order to create that illusion, what I like to do is be really cognizant of precision, especially if this is going to be an art piece that gets printed really big or gets put on a wall as a gift. I really want to sort of have the attention to detail that matters here that you may or may not see when you're looking at this, like sort of from far away on a screen. So here I am just rounding out the very last of my mistakes here. Cool, that selection is looking great. To get out of quick mask mode, I'm going to hit the Q button. And before I do anything else, I definitely want to select, save selection like I was just talking about, and call that edited hand. So I can recall that at any given point in time. And I'll hit OK. If I hit Command C to copy, I can pop over here to my collage, my fake imaginary landscape format. I'm going to hold on to actually the building version that is the feathered one. Command V. Woo! That hand is really, really big. And you know that because we checked the image size of this document before we put it in. Now, you'll also notice that if I'm putting this on a straight white background, you're going to see even more of those imperfections. I could be even better about going back through and, you know, pulling that selection up again and spending the time, but I want our demo to keep moving. So we're going to do that. And edit, transform, scale. Again, I want to scale down, but I don't want to scale up in order to preserve my pixels. I'm going to hold down my Option key so I can preserve that aspect ratio. And then I'll put the hand right there in the corner, hit Enter or Return. Cool. If I wanted to, I could come over here to my hands layer and hit Command click on that layer thumbnail to reselect it. Command copy and come over to my interesting building collage here and hit Command V to paste it. Oh, that's kind of cool. You'll notice that the layer order that you have, call that hand, is going to be literally what sits on top of what. So if I do put that hand underneath the two pink buildings, it will be underneath those other collages, which is kind of cool. Or I can put it on top of everything with that layer and it will come forward. If I hit, for example, edit, transform, flip vertical, boom. I could take it and move it down here and then maybe put it underneath those buildings so there's a sort of interest going on with that as well. Cool. So we're getting somewhere. All right, so at this point, we've gone through a bunch of the selection tools. We looked at quick mask mode and some of the ways that you can modify those selections as they come into your editing game. There's a couple of other things that I do want to show you that are pretty useful tools moving forward in this process. Let's say, for example, I know that I have, put that down here. I know that I have these two parts of the pink buildings that are hanging down over these fingers here. I'm going to hit Command plus, kind of zoom in, and maybe I want to get rid of this area. But I've already made the selection and I've already copy pasted them in. Well, there is a way that you can modify your selection after the fact, and this is through layer masks. Pause point right here. Remember, we are editing non-destructively. Layer masks allow you to edit non-destructively because anything that you take away, you can always get back. An amateur Photoshop user, if they wanted to get rid of this part, they'd probably come over to the pink building, they'd hit the eraser tool, which, you know, is useful in certain situations, and probably erase this all out. If you're a professional Photoshop user, you'll only make those adjustments through the use of layer masks. So I'm going to find this little button that looks like a little camera, very similar to the quick mask mode over on our toolbar, but this one lives in your layer panel. If I add a layer mask to that pink building, I'm now linked to this square on the pink building, and if I turn off and on my eyeball, just so you know which one I'm utilizing, I can do that. I can turn off all of them just by clicking the first one and dragging it down. Nice. Drag up, drag down, very useful tool. If I want them all to go away, I can hold down the Option key and click my background eyeball, and everything above it will disappear. Also very useful. But let's get back to the layer mask. I have a layer sitting on top of this now, and you can think of a layer mask sort of like the makeup that you put on in the morning because it covers everything or it doesn't cover everything, or you can chisel into it what you want and then always go back and take it away. So for example, on this layer mask that's sitting on top of the pink building, what I can do is grab my brush tool, hit the letter B, just like with our quick mask mode. Oh, I can erase out information that I don't want, or I can bring that information back in. So I've now erased that out. It looks like I have a tiny, tiny bit left here. Yeah, I have my opacity up. Blending mode is at normal. It's fine. The V button moves that around. Have a tiny bit of a shadow here. So I'm, oh, JaNae, this is what you did wrong. This is actually a great example. Somehow, my background color got set to blue. And what do those two need to be? Black and white. Otherwise, you're going to get moments like this where you're like, why do I have this little ghosted part here? I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hop back over. If I am adjusting the mask, I need to make sure that it is selected as the area that I'm working with. So now it is selected again. I'm going to grab my B for brush tool, black on white, white on black. Hopefully this works. It's not doing anything. I'm going to hit X. Oh, hey, I can bring it back in if I hit X. And if I hit X again, I can pull it back out. Make sure that I'm definitely on black. Here we go. Woo! All right. And so I can get rid of that whole dark area and kind of sculpt it away. The reason why this is non-destructive is because if I hit X again, I can bring it all back. X, X. So that is how layer masks can become extremely useful for looking at the relationship between how layers are sitting on top of each other. And we're going to do a bunch of advanced layer masks and adjustment layers when we go into our demo next week. For now, I want you to just get comfortable making sure that you are on the correct layer as you are erasing things out or pulling things back in, specifically as it applies to making selections. Awesome. So there might be a couple of you guys who are sort of like, okay, that's all well and good, JaNae, but what about, like, how the heck would you select something like these palm trees? Because look at this magnetic lasso tool. How's that going to get around every single little strand of these palm tree leaves? That is a great question. There is a way to magically do this in Photoshop. If, say, our backgrounds are relatively similar, being what color are our palm trees on? Well, they're on a blue sky. Say I want to put palm trees on a different sky, like over here. Here's what I'm going to do in this case, and your layer mask is going to be really important for this, and your general rectangular marquee selection tool is going to be really important for this. If I hit the M button, I can select these, this sort of square of these palm trees. I'm being super non-specific because I know that this would just be a total mess to go through anyway if I were to use my marquee tool. Hit Command C to copy it. I'm going to come over to my sky image and I'm going to hit Command V to paste it. Cool, and the photos themselves are actually not too dissimilar in size, so this is working fairly well. But the colors are definitely different. If I want this to look integrated into the environment, Photoshop has a really interesting way of managing the relationship between layers and how they sit on top of each other. Go ahead and label that. I have this palm trees layer on top of the background. Now, if I come up here, still within my layers panel, it says normal. This is the thing I'm going to click. There are a bunch of different Photoshop algorithms. Whoa! Awesome, that one might work. That essentially unpack the potential relationships between different layers to make them work better together. Amateur Photoshop users think that these are all cool acid wash effects to just add to anything that breathes, anytime, anywhere, to give it a cool, hip look. You can totally do that, but as a warning, anyone who knows anything about Photoshop will be able to say, oh, so you just added like a vivid light thing to these palm trees to make them look super washed out in LA. That's what you did. Cool. All right. Great. Let's move forward. Similar to being able to identify an Instagram filter, for example. It's cool, but it's not that cool. If someone who actually knows Photoshop looks at it, they will figure it out pretty quickly. That being said, I'm all about experimentation, and if something's really working for you, go for it. I will not judge. But the reason these different blending modes were initially designed were so that you could get moments like this. If I hit darken, the algorithm says anything that's dissimilar or darker will come forward, and the areas that are lighter in this layering relationship will sort of disappear. If I move the palm tree around, it works better in some places than others, obviously, but now we have a tool to make that work for us. The layer mask. So I'm going to add a layer mask to our palm trees, and then go ahead and grab my B or brush tool. Good, I have black on white this time. Woo! And I'm literally erasing out while I'm on that mask. We need to pull some of this guy back in. I am erasing out the area that is definitely obvious that we layered in. But this is great because it allows you the opportunity to layer in really different content that would be super difficult to use your magnetic lasso tool on. Oops. And have that come through. Having a bit of a glitch going on here, so trying not to disturb it too much. There we go. Nice. So now I have palm trees in the sky, and that is awesome. If I wanted to duplicate those, if I right click on this layer, control click on a Mac, I can go to duplicate layer, and it comes with the mask and everything, so I can hypothetically add even more palm trees. I can hold down the Option key also and drag out a layer as well as a keyboard shortcut here, and essentially create as many palm trees as I want. Now obviously I'd have to go back through and work with each and every one of the layers here. You know, maybe this one won't work quite as well because it's against the clouds here, but kind of awesome. I am going to go through and erase some of this out because I need this image for the last thing that I want to show you guys today in our selections demo in Photoshop. So bear with me for a second while I clean this up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just eliminate some of the background here, get this image ready for the last part of our demo. Here we go. Awesome. Now, another thing to mention is up here, I do have a history tool, which a lot of people talk about as far as the ability to sort of go back and forth in Photoshop to move forward, to move backward, etc. The history tool is really useful for this because if I come up here, I can go back all these steps before I started editing all those out, and I can also move forward. If you don't see the history dialog box, you can always bring it back by going into Window and History and checking that, and it'll pop right back up for you. I'm going to go over to selection demo image 5 because I have this interesting photo of a blank sort of projector screen for outdoor movie watching, and I'm going to use this to show you something interesting. Let's say we wanted to have something look like it was being projected onto our screen over here. Well, if I come over to my palm trees, again, I've not done the best job of selection, but maybe what I can do is grab my V tool, move these around. Yeah, that works a little bit better. This guy, yeah. Come over here, grab the B for brush. Again, I'm not being quite as obsessive because I do want this demo not to go for ever and ever. Ha. Okay. Yeah, that's good enough for now. If I come up here and grab my rectangular marquee tool, if I want all of this to come with me, again, remember once I do this, I will lose my layer. So I want to make sure that if I'm working on compositing and going from one document to another, that I have it in a way that I want it, because I can't necessarily bring the layers in individually unless I bring the layers in individually. But I'm going to do this in a way where we're going to kind of copy everything together and pull it over to our other demo image. So I'm actually going to utilize the edit copy merged function, edit copy merged, which will mean everything that's within that selection is going to get copied. It will merge those layers together, and then Command V on top of that new background. Obviously, this is huge and it's covering the entire background layer. And you'll also notice that now this layer is its own thing. I cannot edit this anymore. I would really want to make those final edits in the original version that I was working with, or bring in each layer individually, which I did not do, FYI. So if I want to be able to see behind this layer, what I'm actually going to do is take my opacity down. So my layer opacity, I'm going to move that slider down. Okay, cool. So now I can see the image that's underneath. The lower the opacity, the more see-through your image becomes, the more transparent. Then I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Scale, just like before. Hold down my Option key so I can maintain my aspect ratio here. And I'm going to try to position this onto my movie theater board here. That is pretty close. Hit enter. Now you might notice that part of it hangs off, and if I were just adjusting it, I wouldn't even be able to see through that image enough to know what part was hanging off or on. So what I'm going to do is take my opacity down significantly just so that I can kind of see behind this image. I'm going to add a layer mask, and this is really interesting. While I'm on the layer mask, what I can do is grab my rectangular marquee tool and literally draw a square around the part that I want to go bye-bye and hit the delete button, or Command C to cut. Just kidding. Let's hit X. Now let's hit the delete button. There we go. So I just needed to swap my foreground and background layer, hit X, and that disappears. Command D to deselect. I don't always look at what that's set to. I just realize that if it's not doing the thing that I want it to do, then I probably need to switch them around. So now that's gone, but again, because I did this on the layer mask non-destructively, I can always get it back. If I hit the brush tool, I can paint it right back in, which is the beauty of Photoshop. Great, and now I have this lower opacity, which is pretty cool. I could increase it back again if I wanted that to take up the whole board, but I kind of like some of the texture back there anyway. So I might pull that back down kind of lightly. I could grab that hand image, selection demo image 1, I believe. Command copy and put it over here as well. Again, hand is just massively huge. And scale that down with my Option key. And maybe I want to adjust the opacity of the hand a bit as well. And, you know, I can sort of test and see what it might look like with different blending modes. But I kind of like it with just the lowered opacity. Oh, that's kind of cool. How it essentially becomes a grayscale drawing on there. I kind of like that. Doesn't look too weird, fakey fake, which I really like. Cool. So now I'm off to a great start on this image as well. So I'm going to end our demo here for today, but I hope that between quick mask mode, being able to add layer masks and really start layering things up, that you guys can create an interesting collage of your own utilizing those tools and these 6 demo images. And I want to make sure that you guys are really cognizant of filling in all of the white space as well. We want it to be a total awesome collage. You can copy things, you can repeat things, something that you can put together in maybe an hour's time or so. Don't, you know, spend all of your creative energy on this, since the images are non-unique. The other thing to remember is you cannot use any of my demo images for your major projects. So please, please keep these to your technical exercises. Do not have them appear in your major projects. That's just lazy. You guys should be looking for your own imagery to complete the work. Lastly, let's do a quick check-in. Just make sure you know how to both file, save your final version as both a Photoshop document. So Contag, JaNae, projector image collage .psd, so I know I have my Photoshop version saved, so I can always come back to my layers. But remember, when it comes to what you submit to me into Google Drive, you want to go into File, Save As on your final collage, make sure you select JPEG, and then you're going to call it last name, first name, underscore, technical exercise 1 collage.jpg, and that is the version. Make sure you have this on quality 12 or maximum that you will be submitting to me via Google Drive. So that's our first intro to Photoshop. We're going to do some more advanced compositing techniques next week, so stay tuned. But I hope this gives you a really nice starting point to get going on your ideas and the possibilities of working towards your imaginary landscape project. Okay, so I hope that was really helpful, and especially as you get into your imaginary landscape projects, I hope that you can carry over these skills and make some really interesting pieces of art. Great, thanks everyone.